This week, coffee talk from the Farmers On Air Cafe. What's left in the field and how farmers are digging it up. And tractors, then and now, and some of my favorites. This is the Rural Reflections Podcast. Welcome to the Rural Reflections Podcast. Dave Nelson in Carrington, North Dakota. Grant Nelson here in the studios with Thief River Falls, Minnesota. And we are bravely bringing Cafe Talk onto the airwaves, at least in the first half of the show. Good morning, Dave.
Morning.
You know, most people at the cafe, they usually are talking about how it's either raining too much or not raining enough. Here, we've been pretty good here around the Thief River Falls area in northwestern Minnesota. A little bit dry maybe for digging up crops, but I don't think anybody minded because they got a chance to go out and harvest everything without having to slog their way through the mud. How about out in Carrington there, Dave?
Well, we're still real dry here. We've had, I forget what we had. I think we had 0.2 of an inch of snow moisture, is what they said. So that's probably our biggest rain since early July. But otherwise, it's still pretty good. I mean, some guys are all burning shovels off and digging anyway. A lot of guys have been out with rippers and stuff, trying to break up the hardpack areas where there was water standing last year and most of the summer. And so there's been a variety of field work going on here, even though it's extremely dry. Today they're predicting the possibility of a thunderstorm, so maybe we'll get some late season rain.
Be all right. You know, we get, I see some Salford plows out in this area. Particularly, I just saw a neighbor using one out in the sunflower stalks. Is that considered vertical tillage? Well,
now, Salford actually has a moldboard plow, too.
Oh, they do?
But this is just the Salford Coulter with rolling baskets or something like that.
Yeah, the little wiggly ones with the basket and back.
Yeah, it's vertical tillage. Salford has two versions of it. They have one that's got about, 5 different tillage options going on with, the Ripple Coulter and rolling baskets, and then it has a more aggressive type of digging that it does too. So there's two styles of them, but they're both considered vertical tillage.
Okay. I like watching them. They really seem to be able to go through a lot of crop quick. I remember a couple of years ago when we had some really dry conditions up here. I never saw it myself, but I heard of plows or shovels being so hot that you could see them glowing even at night. Do you ever see anything like that?
Well, I haven't, but you never know, because now with the advent of these vertical tillage things, speed has really been introduced into it, and some guys think they have to go 11 miles an hour with them, which maybe in right conditions is okay, but for us out here it's not realistic because of rocks and so on. But I know there's always that possibility, and maybe it's just legend,
Yeah, very well could be. Now this week I saw corn being combined and I saw sunflowers being combined. I've heard that the flowers are pretty light from people I've talked to around here. Corn wasn't corn and grain was good. The wheat was real good. Soybeans kind of light. What's going on out there in North Dakota, out in central North Dakota?
Well, I think it's probably about the same as you're talking about. Any of the early planted wheat was not nearly as good as some of the later planted because it was muddy to start out with, and it was in early. Everybody wants wheat in early, but it was a little too early for the conditions. So wheat turned out to be pretty decent. Yields weren't, huge, but there's some 60 bushel, and that it was good quality. Soybeans, I would say if you took and put a circle around the whole of central North Dakota, you'd have probably a 25, 30 bushel average because it wasn't that good. There were places where it was, just kind of depending on the soil and the timing. Corn, high quality, high test weight. It was dry, and yields were, in the low hundreds to, maybe up to 150 in some places, but nothing spectacular. And I was to Bismarck this week, and there's still wheat standing out in places out there that I'm sure is, just either it's cover crop that headed again, or I don't know. A lot of guys were baling cover crop this week that had laid under the snow for a while.
Okay.
And it just so happened to dry it out. So maybe that was its intention too, but this stuff was headed out and standing there. I don't know. Probably no kernels in it, but
that's interesting.
There's a real mix of all kinds of things out there, but by and large, we're done harvesting anyway.
Yeah. I've noticed that too. The cover crop has really been strong around our area. I think it just had long enough time to get some growth to it this year, which it doesn't always do. Well, okay, that's our coffee and cafe talk. We're going to take a break, do my online column, and when we come back, we're going to talk about track layers, those with rubber and steel, right here on the Rural Reflections podcast. I'm Grant Nelson. This is Rural Reflections. Post-election and amidst COVID-19, I'd like to choose a topic that is at once comforting, exciting, and without controversy. The subject, hot dish. I suspect there are at least a few people who did not grow up around these parts, so I'll let them know that hot dish is also known as casserole. I have written about hot dish before from the perspective of the post-funeral meal, which often includes hot dish. I want to start with that last sentence, as hot dish is featured at a funeral, not only because it's scalable to large groups, because it's the ultimate comfort food. I think it provides an emotional cue, because many Midwesterners were brought up around a large roaster of hot dish. Gathering with your family was once a nice way to catch up with what your family had done that day. That memory of family and togetherness is a great comfort. And the smell and taste of hot dish can trigger that feeling. My own memories are triggered by the sound a serving spoon makes as it cuts through the surface of hot dish. That sound makes my ears feel good and takes me back to the 1970s dinner table. A hot dish is more than just a memory, however. It's a standalone comfort on its own. Opening the lid of a pan of hot dish is like peering into a whole other world. I think it's even better with a foil roaster as you peel open the top foil layer, especially when none of the cheese is stuck to the bottom of the cover. I hate to see cheese wasted. Hot dish, which is slightly roasted and stuck to the side of the container, is much more welcome, as this is not a waste, but rather a delicacy. The whole experience of hot dish is almost all-encompassing. It's almost like that feeling of being in a hot bath after a day in the cold. I almost feel like the hot dish envelops a person as the heat from the outside meets the heat it creates from the inside. I made hot dish last week. The ingredients included a few staple items plus every leftover from the last 3 days. The key ingredient that truly sets off the flavor and carefully hides the ingredients is cream of something soup. We usually make hot dish with some cayenne pepper too. Contrast with the creamy texture. It's fantastic. My hot dish was actually disguised last week as either a pot pie or a shepherd's pie. Hard to call. I made crust for the top, but it was thick enough that it had a texture like shepherd's pie. It was good and fed us that night plus several more meals and reheated very well, thank you. The hot dish experience is one of a hungry tourist passing through a land of layers and textures as he or she stares out the window at a world of ingredients happily at work together. to sink into this hot tub of sauce, cheese, and noodles gives a person the same warm feeling as you might have in a real hot tub, watching the snow slowly fall like memories into view. I'm Grant Nelson. This is Rural Reflections. Welcome back to the Rural Reflections podcast. Dave Nelson's over in Carrington. Grant Nelson here at the studios at Thief River Falls Radio. Now, back in the day, the idea of using a track layer, or a caterpillar as it's called, out in the field was, it's kind of an old idea used on some of the bonanza farms and that sort of thing. Low horsepower, lots of torque, slow moving vehicles. And but that might not necessarily have been a matter of just the horsepower or anything like that. It could have also been the tracks too, right, Dave?
Yeah, the tracks were probably better traction for a small package like that. No duals necessary, anything like that, So when I moved to North Dakota, there was still a couple of guys using D4 cats to pull a fairly large cultivator, probably because they already had a little cat or something. That's why they just put it into dual use, and they all of a sudden had something that would pull that 36-foot cultivator, just like some of the bigger new tractors.
Yeah, because you get a little bit better, you get better traction, and I would imagine there's even a better torque ratio getting down to the ground just because it's of the gear reduction and that sort of thing, isn't there?
I'm sure there is, because I don't think those little cats had probably no horsepower near what some of the tractors did, and they were out there, pulling and lugging away.
Yeah, no, we had Pliny Holton, Jacob Best, and a bunch of different other people who put together caterpillars way back when, and they were good for construction, and they used them on the big bonanza farms, and even some of the smaller ones like you talk about, they used them out on the farm even pretty frequently. But somewhere along the line, we found rubber tracks, and really Case IH found the quad track, which kind of changed a lot of things.
Yeah, they really did make an impact there with that quad track. The patent was good for 20 years, and suddenly everybody has a quad track after 20 years. We have one of the original ones right now in our shop that we're doing a little bit of repair work on for a guy, but he's hanging on to it. It's up in the near 15,000 hours on it, and he just keeps using it. It's been pretty much relegated to some tillage and grain cart now. It's the only one they put on the grain cart. And so it certainly did start something. And there's a lot of different reasons for it, but all you have to do is go out in the spring in the mud, and you'll pick out one of the big reasons. And that's where you can go a little earlier and do some vertical tillage and dry the top off a little bit so that you can hopefully get out there and seed a little sooner.
And it seems like moving from steel tracks to the rubber tracks, I mean, it was more practical as far as traveling from field to field, and even in speed, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, the rubber tracks, adding suspension to them and so on, I mean, they travel at the same speed as they do with a wheeled tractor. If you ever took a cleat track down a road, the first thing you'd do is get scorned by the neighbors. But I remember the guy that I'm specifically thinking of, he kind of had a road map around his farmland, because at the time, nobody farmed 30 miles apart, So he'd cross a road at a certain spot. You'd find tires piled along the road where they would cross a paved road,
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. So that's all changed with the advent of the rubber tracks. It's just like taking tires down the road now.
And I always think that, the difference between, there was two different kinds of tractors. There was the quad track that Case IH had, and then everybody else went with almost a traditional style like you would have seen with a regular Caterpillar, where there's just one track on each side. And I've seen them both in action. And it seemed to me like having a track at each corner instead of one shared one. Well, one benefit was it did a little bit better out in the mud. The other ones, they had to just turn so one way or the other, and you could get kind of it was kind of tough if you were pulling an implement or something like that. Whereas if you had a track at each corner where the tire would have normally been, it seemed like the turning characteristics were more similar to what you had with a regular tractor.
Yeah, well, with the quad track, you could turn away like you would with a normal tractor. With the single track tractors, you have to stop one side, in order to turn. So what would happen is you'd stop that one side, you'd lose your momentum, and then the other side would spin out.
Yep.
That was the big deal about getting away from a mud hole or that with them. Otherwise, if you're going straight up and down the field, you wouldn't notice that with that. But the quad track behaves just more like an regular articulated tractor. So you have some efficiencies that you pick up with cornering and things like that.
Going back to the old way, I've always wanted to get an Oliver OC3. I just think they look like such a neat looking little Caterpillar, and they kind of had the narrower tracks. So I wonder if they maybe were used in some row crop situations or something. But I always think some of those little older converted Caterpillars from a regular tractor, I just think they look just neat.
Yeah, I think they're really cool too. Actually, we used to have a guy that had a bunch of little John Deere 40 crawlers.
Okay.
And he had farmhand loaders on them, big old high-lift farmhand loaders on them. And used them in his ranching business as his feeding and manure hauling and whatever he could think of to use them for tractors. And he wouldn't have anything but that. He had a fleet of 3, and he had the old D crawlers that he had before that were relegated to the trees now. Mm-hmm. And he just kept them, and it was kind of interesting. He was a Caterpillar farmer all the way, but he didn't have any grain farming. He did just his sheep rancher.
I like that. Yeah, the tractors, there's something else. Dave, you got anything else for us this week?
No, I'm going to see if I can enjoy our nice warm day that we're having today, and I got a little list of work for myself to do today, things to tidy up before winter, and we'll see what happens next week.
That sounds good. We'll talk to you next week. There he is, my brother Dave Nelson from Carrington, North Dakota. I'm Grant Nelson for the Rural Reflections Podcast.